Joy Norman, and I'll be talking about Christian storytelling. Firstly, I'm going to describe or explain what Christian storytelling is, and this refers to the delivery of a story to children in a way that gets them to understand the message, and also to put it in a way that children are able to understand the story that is being shared with them and the principles that are being shared through that story. The person who tells the story is called a storyteller, and the audience is usually children of various ages. Each story has different characteristics, but the main characteristics of a story, each storyteller has characteristics, and in order for one person to be a good storyteller, he or she needs to have the following characteristics. Firstly, they must have lots of vigor and lots of gestures. And gestures are important because children, as you know, learn through actions. So if I'm going to tell a story and I'm going to be looking down and not interacting with children, and I'm not going to be interacting with them, chances are they will not remember the story or even understand it. So you need to be full of vigor to also help the children stay and remain interested in whatever you're relaying to them. Secondly, he or she must be creative in order to attract the attention of the audience. Like I said earlier, if I'm going to be there standing still or sitting down and not being creative in my gestures or the manner in which I'm relaying the story, their attention is going to wane. They may concentrate in the beginning of the story, but towards the end you'll see that their attention span is slowly waning off. Thirdly, the storyteller must enjoy the story they're telling, or they must at least appear like they're interested in sharing the story. Even if they don't enjoy it, let's just pretend to enjoy it so that your audience can also be interested in what is being narrated to them. It also helps to have a storyteller that is using visual aids. Children learn and remember through what they see, through sight. So if I'm going to be talking about an elephant, if I have a picture of an elephant and I show them that this is the elephant I'm talking about, or in the story of Jonah, I have a picture of Jonah and I'm explaining that this is the whale that swallowed this man, and you know, chances are higher that they would remember because I used visual aids. So visual aids are very important, and to be a good storyteller, please use visual aids when you are telling children stories. Fourthly, the storyteller must be resourceful in telling whatever stories that they're going to be telling. The next characteristics is that they need to maintain eye contact. I should not be standing in front of children and looking out through the window and expect children to be able to hear what I'm talking about, show interest in it, and keep focused in whatever I'm telling them if I'm going to be looking at Ndate house throughout the story that I'm telling. So it's important to maintain eye contact when you're telling stories to children. The other characteristics is that they must be of good character. I'm not going to explain further, they just have to be of good character. They must also be presentable. I'm not going to stand in front of children dressed in a manner that is not presentable and expect children to focus on what I'm sharing with them. If I'm going to be standing there with dirty clothes or broken shoes, they'll probably be focusing more on how I'm presented or my presentation instead of what I'm saying to them. So let's try and be presentable when we're telling stories to children. The last one is that he or she must be fluent. And fluency means fluency in language, fluency in speech. The other thing we need to do to ensure that you are fluent is use age-appropriate language. You shouldn't be standing in front of children and using, say, 4 to 5-year-olds and using language that is used by children in high schools, because you will not be communicating to the children. They're going to get lost in what you're saying, and there will be no communication because it's going to be defeated by the barrier in language. Now, a story has different parts, and I'll concentrate mainly on 5 parts of the story. The first part of the story is the title or the theme. So each story must have a title or a theme. Then it must have an introduction. This is where you're going to give a brief introduction or a brief background of what you're going to be talking about. It must then have a main body. After the main body, it must have a climax, and it must then end with a conclusion. Now, there are certain essentials of storytelling that we need to bear in mind when we tell stories to little children or to children of different ages. You need firstly to select a story. Once you've selected a story, you need to make sure that you know the story very well. Now, some stories are stories that we can get from the Bible, others are through life experiences, and I'm sure there are stories that we can make up as we go along, provided there's a reason why we want to tell that story. But whatever the case may be, you just need to know your story very well. You need to then feel the story. And if there's need to, you can modify the story as you go along, either to make it relevant to your audience or to make it relevant for the particular purpose that you're telling it. Then lastly, you need to analyze and outline the story. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, we tell stories to different audiences who may be of different ages, and we may tell stories for different purposes. Now, when we tell stories to younger children, it's important that we try and keep the stories as short as possible. Firstly, because their attention span is very short. Secondly, they cannot concentrate for very long. And thirdly, because they usually don't sit throughout a story. Now, if it's a short story, they will remember it more than a longer story. It might also help to get children involved in a story. So if you're going to be talking about a penguin, for instance, ask one of the children to stand up and show us how a penguin walks. Does anyone know how a penguin walks? If you get hands in the air, ask one of them. So it helps keep them interested when you involve them in the story. You also need to use vocabulary that they understand. Make sure that your vocabulary is very basic and simple to put the point you want to put across properly. And then we need to also remember that one story can be used for relaying different messages or teaching different lessons. For instance, the story of Jonah and the whale can stress firstly the importance of obedience. It can also teach us that you cannot run away from God. It can also teach us about the love that God has for other people. Or for other children, they could simply just learn that the whale was a very big fish that swallowed a person. So whatever point you need to put across, you can stress that in the message that you are sharing. And remember that one story can have different lessons or different messages that can be shared. I'm going to be talking about the story outline. And a story outline is a hierarchical organization of an idea. So in this case that I'm going to be presenting, we have 5 different outlines. The first one is the setup. Now the setup is what describes where and when. Where the story happened and when it happened. Still under the setup, we're going to be describing the protagonist. Now the protagonist is usually the main character and the person who does good in the story. Then we're going to describe the conflict. Most stories will have a conflict. Now under the conflict, we're going to describe the antagonist. And the antagonist is usually the bad guy or the person who opposes the protagonist. Then we will describe the nature of the conflict. After conflict, we're going to describe the reaction to the conflict. Here we're going to talk about what the good guy, the protagonist, does, and what the bad guy, the antagonist, does. And then we're going to talk about resolution, how the conflict between the antagonist and the protagonist was resolved. And lastly, we'll talk about the aftermath, what happened to the antagonist, and what were the lessons that we learned from the conflict and the story. Now, there are different reasons why one may tell a story, or different purposes of storytelling. You can tell a story to educate, which is what we usually do in our classes with our children. We can tell a story to inform, or we could tell a story for entertainment purposes. Now, entertainment is not what we usually do in church, but some stories, depending on how they are told, may be entertaining to the audience. But our focus is usually to educate and to inform. And under Christian storytelling, the following 6 points are the importance of storytelling that I've come up with. It's important to tell Christian stories to children so that we can share the good news with children in an age-appropriate manner, and also in a manner that will help them remember the stories. So to share the good news in an age-appropriate manner that will help them to remember the stories. Some stories also encourage and inspire children to do good, to either be good or to do good deeds. Other stories instill profound lessons from the divine wisdom of Jesus. For example, stories that we tell through parables. So these help children to instill profound lessons from the divine wisdom of Jesus. Some stories are told to groom children in faith and to help mold and grow them spiritually. Unlike normal stories or stories that are not Christian, Christian stories groom children in faith and help mold and grow them spiritually. Some stories also teach children different principles, such as health principles. So you could make up a story or come up with a story that has within it, or as a lesson, the benefit of, say, exercising, or the benefit of eating healthy, so that you then are able to relay the message of health to children. Lastly, children are encouraged and are also able to get in the habit of reading the Bible and enjoying and looking forward to read it, because you've told them stories from the Bible that are relatable, that they can understand, and that they can remember. Now, the sources of Christian stories may be very different. The first one is usually the Bible. We get many of the children's stories from the Holy Book. The second one is life experiences. The third one is nature. The fourth one is sacred history. And the last one is books, magazines, and newspapers. In concluding, I'm going to talk about the different types of stories. The first type of stories is called a myth. And this is usually a traditional story that concerns the early history of a people, or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. So the story is usually not true, but it does involve the early history of a particular people and involves supernatural beings or events. I don't know of the type of stories you have here, Madhuri, as a myth that you can give us as an example. here in Lesotho. I can give you examples that I have from back home.
Cannibals.
Sorry?
There's a belief amongst Basotho that they used to be cannibals.
Basotho.
Yeah, they used to be cannibals.
Why is it a myth?
It's a myth.
Why do you think it's a myth?
Is it not a myth?
It's not a myth. It's not a myth. It's not a myth.
It's not a myth?
No.
Can we have an example of a myth? Can anyone give us an example of a myth? Yes, ma'am.
Somebody taking orally a red wardrobe and iron. It's a myth.
Oh, okay.
And swallowing it.
And swallowing it.
And making the voice what was a male voice turn into
A female voice.
like a female
Okay.
voice.
All right. Thank you for that example. In Botswana, we have a story or a myth about a man called Matsieng. Matsieng was apparently a giant who ate children. We actually even have a place called the Caves of Matsieng. And there's apparently a very, very big footprint of Matsieng. I've seen it, but I can't say for a fact that it is Matsieng's footprint. But that is a typical example of a myth. Then we also have fairy tales. And fairy tales are short stories that belong to the folklore genre, and they usually involve magic and enchantments or mythical or fanciful beings. And a typical example would be like Cinderella. Cinderella was a fairy tale story. Then we have fables, and fables are usually spread abroad by oral transmission. And they're usually found in literature of most countries and of most people. And although most of them are not true, they are made up or they are told to teach the reader some moral lessons. I don't know what examples you have, but in the English language there was a story of the hare and the tortoise. Do you remember that? Yes. What was the lesson we learned in that story? Because there was a moral lesson from that story. You don't remember? Does anyone remember the story of the hare and the tortoise?
Yes, I do. The
Yes.
moral of the story is that you have to be patient and persevere to succeed.
Yes.
And
So
being fast doesn't necessarily mean.
thank you very much. So in the story there was a race. The tortoise and the hare were racing together. And although the tortoise was extremely slow, it eventually finished the race before the hare that was a lot faster. So fables are usually made up to teach the reader moral lessons. Then we've got legends, and legends are stories that are shared and retold from the past, and they're usually regarded as historical, although they are not verifiable. Do you have any such in Lesotho?
Yeah.
Yes, that. Munnawa? What does it mean? What is it about?
A big monster ate all the people. So Shanyana Sankatana came and used the spear and opened up and the people escaped. No ways.
In our country we have the same, it's just a different it's exactly, it sounds the same. Yes. So such. Can we talk about Tarabusiwe and what used to happen to the mountain and the genre of what type of story is that?
The mountain grew up a black.
It's a myth. It's a myth. It's a legendary myth.
You can go ahead.
I think it's a legend.
Is it a legend?
One at a time.
What apparently happened?
What apparently happened is, from my knowledge, is when they first arrived at Kabakusi, the traditional doctor had put medicine, I'll say medicine around it, a rope around it, to make the enemies perceive the mountain as huge when they approached. So it didn't actually grow or anything, but when they were trying to climb it, it seemed as if it was hard to get to the top. And then in the morning when they looked at it, it looks
like normal.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's an example of a myth.
I feel like it's a legend.
It's a legend. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we all
because I think for me the reason why it was hard to go up is because it was steep, not necessarily because of the
Remember, Snappi knows a different version of
Then it becomes a myth.
Yeah, how men?
Oh,
how is it?
Okay.
And the last type of story we have is allegory. And this is a story or a poem or a picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, which is typically a moral or political one. Now, I'm going to go back to the characteristics of a good storyteller. I'm going to just demonstrate in a minute how I'm going to be reading the story to the children in BCBs. BCBs are 6-year-olds?
Yes.
And I want you to please point out to where I'm going wrong and what I should have done differently. The story is called Fish Don't Need Snorkels. Fish don't need snorkels. So this is me. The children are walking into class. I'm seated. Good morning, children. The story for today is Fish Don't Need Snorkels. Does a fish need a snorkel to breathe underwater? No. God gave the fish gills to breathe underwater. Does a giraffe need a ladder to reach the top of the tree? No. God gave the giraffe a long neck to reach the top of a tree. Does a turtle need to search for a house to live in? No. God gave the turtle a shell to live in. End of the story.
You are talking to yourself.
You're not interested, you're keeping up with eye contact.
You're not enjoying the story.
You're not audible enough.
Can someone demonstrate how they would have done the first 5 pages of the story to my class? Menala, please assist.
Good morning, children.
Good morning, Auntie.
My name is Auntie Nala. So the name of the story is, please read out, say back.
Does a fish need a snorkel to breathe underwater?
Does it class?
No.
Yes.
No.
All right. Okay. The answer is
No.
It's a big no. So God gave fish gills to breathe underwater. Do you understand that? Because fish stays in water. Do you agree, children?
Very much. Now you see the difference. Immediately she was able to catch the attention of the audience. She was able to interact with them. She was able to give eye contact, and the children became very interested, and she also engaged them. Now, like I said earlier, visual aids, it helps to show them, to get them, ask them questions so that they are then in tune with you and interested in the story. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Oh, you have a question?
Yes, yes. My question is in line with Christian storytelling, especially in the setup of Seventh-day Adventists. Are there any restrictions as to what stories we may share with the kids? Like I heard you mentioned sometimes like myths, legends, and things like that, and some that we can just think of in our maybe based on past experiences. Are there some restrictions as to no, you cannot maybe tell kids an unverifiable story, something like that?
I really think it depends on the environment and what interests the kids. Well, I once read that in one of the, while I was homeschooling with my kids, they say in church definitely there are restrictions. For instance, you cannot tell a myth in a church because other kids are visitors, and imagine waking up in the morning and coming to church to being told a myth. But at home, you can, because you are trying to take what are your children good at, the listening skills, the attentive, and you as a parent, what are you good at? If you are not good at something, then you give to other people.
Okay.
I think she answered it very correctly. Is there any other input? Any other? No, nothing? Thank you very much, Manala, for assisting.